Welcome to the Miller Center. I'm Brian Ballo. I direct the National Fellowship Program at the Miller Center, and I'm also a professor in the History Department here at UVA. This is the first in our GAGE Colloquia series. GAGE stands for Governing America in a Global Era, and it's one of the many scholarly programs here at the Miller Center. And because this is the first one, I will just tell you a few of the folks who will be coming through this fall. Suzanne Mettler, a political scientist at Cornell, will be talking about how Americans perceive their government and how policy visibility shapes American democracy. David Lake, who works on foreign policy and international relations, will be coming from UC San Diego to talk about America's hegemonic dilemmas, building legitimate and loyal states in an age of global insurgency. And I'm not mentioning all of these, but another scholar who will be coming from Harvard is Nancy Rosenblum, who will be talking about good neighbor nation, presumably not an insurance company. So as you can see, we really bring in on a regular basis some of the very leading scholars in the world, and that's a perfect segue to Allan Brinkley, who is the Allan Nevins Professor of History at Columbia University. And though it pains him to mention the word, a former provost at Columbia University, a good friend and a good friend of the fellowship program at the Miller Center. We are also, I'd like to welcome our Miller Center Fellows. They're some of the leading scholars from top programs in history and political science around the world, and they're here for their fall conference. They come from Columbia. We just can't seem to reject anybody from Columbia, Allan. They come from Stanford. They come from leading programs all over the world, and we want to welcome them. And when we have the scholars in town, we always try to get a senior scholar from history or political science. And I'll thank Allan in advance, because right after we put him through this drill, he's going to meet with our fellows and talk to them about unimportant things like how to get a job in academia. Well, as I said, Allan is the Nevins Professor. He is one of the leading authorities on 20th century U.S. history, political history, the history. He's best known for his works on the history of liberalism, but he also wrote the most important article on the need to study conservatism. Allan is the author of many books, including The End of Reform, New Deal Liberalism in Recession and War. His most recent book is The Publisher, Henry Luce and His American Century. And Allan is currently working on the John F. Kennedy book, aptly titled John F. Kennedy in the American Presidency series. Many of us know it as the Schlesinger series, really a remarkable series of accessible books, yet sophisticated books on the American president. So we're very, very fortunate to have Allan Brinkley with us today. Commenting on Allan's presentation is my colleague Mark Silverstone. Mark is the Director of Presidential Studies and an Associate Professor here at the Miller Center. He's the author of Constructing the Monolith, the United States, Great Britain, and International Communism, 1945 to 1950. And it's particularly appropriate that Mark make these comments today, both for his role in the Presidential Recordings Program and the fact that his current scholarly project is a book titled the Kennedy withdrawal, Camelot, and the American commitment to Vietnam. So I think many of you know the drill. Allan will talk for 10 or 15 minutes. Mark will comment for 5 or 10 minutes. I will cut them off if they go over that. And then we will turn to all of you for questions to our honored guest and my esteemed colleague commentator. Allan.
Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here at the Miller Center, and thank you all for coming. As Brian has said, I've just finished a short book on John Kennedy that is part of the Schlesinger series, and it is indeed titled John F. Kennedy, as are those are the titles for all of the books. It's simply the name of the president. And these books are relatively short. Many of them are written by people who are not scholars, but nevertheless have written very good books. I was fortunate, of course, to have profited by the extraordinary amount of scholarship that's already been produced on John Kennedy. But I was also fortunate that the Kennedy Library has made a significant amount of archival material online, and this digital archive allowed me to rely not only on earlier scholarship but also on original sources. So I want to start just by reading a little excerpt from the introduction to this book, and then I'll just say a few more words and open this up for conversation. John Kennedy's legacy remains enormous, nearly half a century since his death. The reality of his presidency may not have lived up to his global reputation, but in his short life, this reticent and pragmatic man became, in the eyes of the world, a charismatic leader who, in his life and in his death, became a symbol of hope and purpose. He was the first president that I was old enough to care about, and I grew up devouring stories about him in the newspapers and magazines and on television. I stood on Capitol Hill in 1961 to watch his inauguration, and I stood on Pennsylvania Avenue in 1963 to see his funeral cortege move up the hill to the Capitol Rotunda while I overheard a transistor radio in the crowd describing the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald. The drama of his life and the tragedy of his death left an indelible mark on almost everyone in my generation, as it did on millions of people around the world, and even on many others who were born long after he died. From the beginning, Kennedy's presidency seemed different. He was hugely popular through most of his presidency, described constantly by such words as charisma, grace, vigor, purpose. He was young, he was rich, he was handsome, he was witty, he was eloquent. He published essays, articles, and a book that won a Pulitzer Prize. He had a beautiful wife and a charming young children. He brought a kind of exhilaration to Washington. Arthur Schlesinger wrote of Kennedy in 1965, about this time, the capital city, somnolent in the Eisenhower years, had suddenly come alive. The air had been stale and oppressive. Now fresh winds were blowing. There was the excitement which comes from the injection of new men and new ideas, the release of energy which occurs when men of ideas have a chance to put them into practice. His presidency remains embedded in the images of many Americans, and I think that will probably continue for many more years. A decade after his death, however, many historians were treating Kennedy much more lightly than Arthur Schlesinger did. In the scholarly rankings of presidents since World War II, Kennedy has tended to rank mostly in the middle of the pack. The political scientist Richard Neustadt, a great admirer of Kennedy and a man greatly admired by Kennedy in turn, Neustadt remarked in the 1970s that he will be just a flicker, forever eluded by the record of his successors. I don't think history will have much space for John Kennedy. That turns out not to be true. Stories began to emerge about his many sexual partners, about his serious hidden diseases, about his complicity in the sleazy CIA mafia efforts to undermine the Castro regime and even to kill Castro himself. His first year in office was, as he himself admitted, a disaster. He was unable to pass most of the legislation he proposed. He was slow and reluctant to embrace the civil rights movement, conservative in his embrace of Keynesianism, aloof and ineffective in his dealings with Congress. Through most of his presidency, he was largely reactive, driven by external events rather than by his own goals. A plan by the Eisenhower administration drove him heedlessly into the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs. A decision by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, encouraged by what he considered Kennedy's weakness, drove him into the Cuban Missile Crisis. A decade of precedent led him reluctantly but decisively into Vietnam. That Kennedy was not always as bold as he wanted the world to believe was not perhaps a weakness, but his worst decisions were often his boldest ones. None of this seemed to hurt him. His rhetoric almost always got him out of trouble. He promised to get, as he put it, the country moving again. He sought a national purpose. He asked America to sacrifice for the goal of all. Americans liked these challenges, even if they did little to meet them. And for much of his presidency, his public approval rating, in fact, for almost all of his presidency, his public approval was rating well above 70% or more. When's the last time a president has had 70% approval? Like most presidents, he had gone through bad times and good times, successes and failures. His administration was dominated by many problems and crises that he encountered in Cuba, Laos, Berlin, Vietnam, and in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. Some of these crises he managed adroitly and at times courageously. Others he failed to resolve. It would be hard to call him a great president, but neither was he a failure. He contributed to a reshaping of the Cold War, making it somewhat less dangerous and somewhat more manageable. His presidency launched dramatic new programs, the Civil Rights Bill, Medicare, the outlines of the War on Poverty. None of them became law in his lifetime, but all of them became law after his death. And in part because of it, that's why those programs actually got passed. Perhaps most surprising of all, John Kennedy, who almost never revealed passion, seemed to many people a very passionate and idealistic liberal. Norman Mailer said after JFK's death, "For a time we felt the country was ours. Now it's theirs again." But Mailer missed the point. In his lifetime, Kennedy was never entirely ours, whatever that means, but neither was he theirs. Only after his death did he become the property of the world. The story of John Kennedy's life is not just important for what he did. It was also what his life meant and still means to millions of people around the world. And his presidency, for better or worse, was the beginning of a transformation of American life. So the piece of this book that I've distributed today is called Flexible Response, and it's the story, really, of the emergence of a of a foreign policy in the Kennedy years. It was preceded by a chapter about the most disastrous event of his presidency, the Bay of Pigs. And I'm not going to talk about the Bay of Pigs, but I do want to make the argument that the Bay of Pigs shaped, to a large degree, the entirety of his presidency. Cuba never went away from the Bay of Pigs, from the CIA insurgencies in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it also weakened him. It allowed Khrushchev to in his summit meeting in Vienna with Khrushchev, he was overpowered by Khrushchev because after the Bay of Pigs, he felt that Kennedy was a weak man. And at that summit, he was a weak man. He was completely overpowered. And so what is in the chapter that I've distributed is the effort of Kennedy to overcome this sense of weakness that the Bay of Pigs and the summit produced. So I hope that this helps to give you a context for this relatively short part of the book, and I'm happy to open to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
Well, I want to say thank you to Brian for the invitation to participate in this esteemed colloquium series. It's certainly an honor to do so and a privilege to be working with Allan Brinkley as I have a chance to think about what he's written so well. I very much encourage all of you to buy the book when it comes out. It's very crisply written. It moves quite briskly from one topic to another, and I think he's done a wonderful job, as I've seen in this chapter, of describing what happens in 1961. He uses a chronological approach, which is an excellent decision, which is also to say that not everybody does that when they write on Kennedy. At times they will write on Kennedy and civil rights, or Kennedy and Vietnam, or Kennedy and various other domestic issues. But by adopting a chronological approach, he can really weave events together so you can see the impact of one on another. And I fully agree that Cuba and the Bay of Pigs sets the stage for the entirety of his presidency. I was thinking about chaos and complexity theory and sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and very much everything that flows from the disaster at the Bay of Pigs defines his presidency. I also like the way that Allan, at the beginning of this chapter, describes JFK as both cautious and reckless. And in doing so, he hits both historiographical nodes. Those folks who have written about Kennedy as prudent, as not willing to commit ground troops, let's say, to Vietnam, or to follow through on the encouragement of the military to either land American troops on Cuba or to continue with the air assault. I think Kennedy is cautious in many respects, and those authors have him right, particularly when they talk about him not reaching for the belligerent solution in October of 1962, when Kennedy stood alone against his advisors in adopting for a less militaristic response in the missile crisis. But Kennedy is also reckless, as Allan points out very well, in continuing to pursue regime change in Cuba throughout the entirety of his administration. And in many ways, it's that pursuit that gets him in further trouble into the missile crisis himself, as both Khrushchev and Castro believe that Kennedy is fully committed to mounting an invasion. In fact, there are 4 such instances in which Castro and Khrushchev will be talking about this, and the need that Castro feels for more support, one of the reasons why Khrushchev will decide to place intermediate and medium-range missiles in Cuba in October of '62. If you were to have a chance to write a subsequent revised edition to the volume, there may be ways to enhance that understanding. And so I want to say a couple of things about that in the rest of my remarks. the chapter, Flexible Response, is more expansive than what the colloquium, the title of the colloquium has been listed as, Cuba and Berlin. Allan does go into flexible response. He does go into the idea that Kennedy needed a broader set of tools at his disposal to counter Soviet provocations. The Eisenhower approach of massive retaliation was insufficient, particularly in an age of brushfire wars, when the conflicts were likely to take place in the Third World, when nuclear weapons would be meaningless. And so he's very good on that. The Vienna summit with Khrushchev is a centerpiece of the chapter, and he does a great job of outlining Kennedy's troubles there, as he has mentioned. Mongoose, as well as the Mongoose being the continued effort to undermine the Castro regime following the Bay of Pigs. And then also Allan addresses the issue of Southeast Asia at the end of 1961, and I'll have some more to say about that in a bit. I like the fact that Allan notes that the failure at the Bay of Pigs had a bigger impact on the means that Kennedy would choose to undermine Castro than the ends. He remained firmly committed to the idea of regime change, of destabilizing Castro, but now Kennedy would do so through covert means, more covert means than through the Bay of Pigs, a much more overt approach. Kennedy would turn to different advisors now in response. He would downplay the role of experts, would privilege people such as Bobby Kennedy, his brother, who we would rely on more as a foreign policy advisor, Theodore Sorensen, nominally a domestic policy advisor who would come to play a larger role in foreign policy. Kennedy had even mused that in a second term, Ted Sorensen might become his national security advisor, as well as Maxwell Taylor, who Kennedy brings in after the Bay of Pigs as a military representative to try to help him figure out what makes sense in terms of the recommendations that the military is actually making for him. Other advisors are in and out. Chester Bowles, who had criticized Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs, is out. George Ball is in as his replacement as an undersecretary. The CIA director, Allen Dulles, is out as well. So while Kennedy is still committed to regime change, the means he's going to use to effect that is different, and the people he's going to rely on for advice will change as well. I would be interested in hearing how Allan answers the question, Kennedy's own question, how could I have been so stupid? It would be helpful because I still, and I think other people still try to wrestle with precisely what it was that led Kennedy to continue on with this invasion plan that was a holdover from the Eisenhower administration. Was he trapped by his own rhetoric? Was he fearful of partisan recriminations? Was it a matter of ego? Was he simply listening to the wrong people? What was it that led him, as he said, to be so stupid? The second part of what this colloquium nominally, again, was about was Berlin, and I just want to make a few comments about Allan's treatment of Berlin, which is excellent. He does a wonderful job of retelling the story, particularly of the Berlin Wall, in succinct fashion. He notes JFK's repeated focus on West Berlin, a focus that did not sit terribly well with many Americans, nor with many Europeans, feeling as though Kennedy was going to abandon those folks in the eastern half of the city. And many recognized rightly that as long as West Berlin was not touched, the Kennedy administration would be okay with Khrushchev's effort and Walter Ulbricht's effort in East Germany to stanch the flow of refugees flowing from east to west. And that was really the great problem that led to the wall itself. I think there might be some other opportunities to describe the fallout from the decision to erect the wall, and that might include the dispatch of Vice President Lyndon Johnson as well as Lucius Clay to Berlin about a week or so after the wall itself. Kennedy was being criticized for not taking a very hard line. He had told Dean Rusk to go ahead and see the baseball game in Washington that he had planned on seeing that Sunday afternoon. Kennedy himself, I think, went out on a yacht later in the day. And people were suggesting, there really is a crisis of morale, a crisis of confidence in Berlin, and you need to do something, Mr. President. So I think there's great PR value, and there's an uplift in morale as a result of Kennedy's decisions that he makes after being goaded by his advisors. I think Allan might also include a reference to the October crisis, a few months later, in which Soviet and American tanks were facing off about 100 yards apart at Checkpoint Charlie. This was a potentially more dangerous crisis than that involving the wall itself, and it was interesting to see how Kennedy used a back channel with Soviet personnel to try to resolve that impasse. It was resolved, and I think that is what ends up taking Berlin off the table, certainly for the remainder of that year, as Khrushchev recognizes that the wall, and maybe even Berlin itself, is not really worth a war. Just a couple broader suggestions, since Allan does a nice job of focusing our attention on the year 1961 itself, and doing so, at least as regards Southeast Asia, with Kennedy's challenge in Laos. In Kennedy's final meeting with Eisenhower before he took the oath of office in January '61, Eisenhower said Laos is really the cork in the bottle. Vietnam was not mentioned, but if Laos goes, all of Southeast Asia can go, and then the dominoes would continue to fall through the Middle East and perhaps even psychological dominoes into Western Europe itself. But Vietnam was important in late 1961 too, and perhaps he addresses it in another chapter, and I'm sure he does. But to stretch the narrative through Vietnam in 1961 would be very helpful, because it helps to put the challenges of that year in context. That is when Kennedy actually shows himself as a fairly cautious person. Again, I think it helps his argument that Kennedy showed a fair amount of caution. His advisors are suggesting that he put in 8,000 combat troops. Maxwell Taylor is doing that after a fact-finding mission. Others are suggesting that Kennedy might want to put in as many as 200,000 troops to stop a potential invasion from north to south, Vietnam, south of the 17th parallel. So Kennedy, again, stands against all of his advisors in opting for the less belligerent solution of those that are on the table. I think there's also something else that can be said regarding Kennedy and military capabilities. Yes, they were interested in pursuing arms control. Test ban was a concern, and Kennedy is able, after Vienna, to rhetorically gird the nation up for the potential long twilight struggle. And Allan makes reference to a particularly important Kennedy speech in July of '61, in which he's calling for increased military expenditures. But I think that in many ways, Kennedy's intimations to Khrushchev that the United States would not only be prepared to meet a threat, but had overwhelming might to do so, that would fall into the category of being more reckless. In October of 1961, around the same time that there is this crisis in Berlin, Kennedy encourages the #2 person at the Defense Department to make a public statement to the effect that not only is there no missile gap in the favor of the Soviets, but the United States has a preponderant ability to deliver a second strike on the Soviets, invalidating Moscow's first strike potential. Khrushchev reacts to this with some measure of alarm. And it's one of the concerns that leads him to seek nuclear parity that will encourage him to place missiles in Cuba in October of 1962. Beyond that, and I'll just finish up, Allan very nicely ends his chapter with a reference to Time magazine and its declaration of JFK as the man of the year, saying that JFK still has a potential to be a great president, even though it was a pretty tough year. I'd be interested in hearing how Allan addresses the matter of JFK's capacity for learning, how he's able to realize the potential that time still holds out for him. How is it that Kennedy learns? What is it that Kennedy learns? Is it that he's relying on his own instincts? Is that what does the trick? Is it that he's relying on fewer and more trusted advisors? What drives his evolution from 1961 through 1963? And just to finish up, because I'm probably backing up against the time limit, it's a wonderful, the book is part of a series that's a wonderful opportunity to introduce Americans to American presidents in a way that they haven't before. These are smart books. They are relatively short. They're directed at the general reader, but they're also directed at scholars as well, very interested and involved laypersons. And I would be interested in hearing how Allan tried to address those challenges in his thought process for composing the book, how he tried to speak to both of those audiences at the same time, because it is a challenge, and it's something that the Miller Center is going to be engaging in next year when we host a conference on how we might reconceptualize or rethink our process of writing presidential history. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Allan, do you want to take a minute or two and respond to the many questions Silverstone turned Socratic on us?
Well, I won't try to respond to all of them, but just a few. I think I just want to go back again to the Bay of Pigs and the extraordinary impact it had on his presidency. And it's not just that it encouraged Khrushchev and others to feel that Kennedy was weak. It also made it possible for the Cuban Missile Crisis to occur. And then for those who believe in conspiracies, assassination conspiracies, the Bay of Pigs is at the core of that too. So if there was a conspiracy, it's very likely that it emerged out of the Bay of Pigs in some way. And when you imagine a conspiracy and you think of Lee Harvey Oswald having lived first in Russia and then in Cuba, it's not a big stretch to think that that could have had some part of the assassination. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but neither am I a wholly believer in the Warren Commission. So this is part of the legacy of Kennedy, the mysteries that remain about his life and about his death. But what I've asked you to look at today is really the shaping of his foreign policy in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, and I'd be glad to answer any questions or comments.
Great. Well, why don't we turn to questions from our audience. I simply ask that you identify yourself, any association that you care to identify if you want to, and that you wait for the microphone to arrive to you. If you'd just raise your hand, or scholars have more subtle ways of signaling they want to ask a question. It's usually their left eyebrow, I've found. But if you signal to me in some fashion that you'd like to ask a question, I will make a list here and call on you. Yes, sir. If you would just wait for the microphone.
Hi, thank you for your presentations today. I'm Dr. Paul Gardner from San Diego, retired psychotherapist. I was 15 when I watched Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald on television. You don't forget those things. You mentioned about assassination theories. That is my question. I really would like to know your best guess as to who exactly killed JFK.
My best guess is that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy. Now, why he did it is another question, but the grassy knoll, all of that, I've never been much interested in it. Why he did it is the question, and that's I don't think we'll ever know the answer. Yeah.
Excuse me.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Emily, you're next.
Thank you. I'm Emily Charnock. I'm a Miller Center Fellow. I was really struck in reading your chapter about the openness that Kennedy exhibited with journalists, about these foreign policy concerns that he had and policies that he was developing. And we normally tend to think of his relationship with the press in terms of them covering up for his personal foibles. So I just wanted to really hear your thoughts on how his relationship with the press shaped his approach to foreign policy, and whether or not it was an appropriate or not type of relationship. Thank you.
Well, I think Kennedy may be the last president who received a significant amount of deference from the press. Most of the people who knew him, most of the press people who knew him, and he liked journalists, and he had close friends who were journalists. And of course, they knew about his philandering, and they knew about his diseases, and he knew about all of these things that the public never knew about. And they never talked about it. It's a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt, whose paralysis was hidden through the entirety of his presidency, and where almost the entirety of the country thought he could walk. Kennedy didn't have such a severe health problem, but he had very severe problems of his own, and no one knew it. His Secret Service men and one of his doctors were heard to say at one point that in his second term he would be in a wheelchair. So that gives you a sense of the level of deference that Kennedy got from the press. Those of you who have ever seen a film or a tape or a television show that shows his press conferences, and you can understand why journalists were so loyal to him. And so he got great press through most of his presidency. There were moments in which he was criticized heavily, but the Bay of Pigs being one of them. But mostly, the press was his friend, and you can't really say that about very many presidents since then. So.
Great. Yes, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Sure. My name is Jim Roth. I am a retired Hill staffer. I have a question on the missile gap at the beginning of the Kennedy administration. As you know, one of the contributions of the U-2 program was that we were aware of the missile gap by the fall of 1960, that it was in our favor. Did the Kennedy campaign elect to ignore the classified briefings they've received on that? And
well, as I understand it, the classified briefings on the missile gap were very thin. Obviously, for Kennedy, the idea of a missile gap was a big and important, or could have been a big and important part of his campaign. And I'm sure he knew that Eisenhower and Nixon were claiming that there was no missile gap. But because there was so much secrecy around it, it was hard for him to know for sure whether it was or not. And there were a number of people who believed, a number of knowledgeable people who believed that there was a missile gap. So certainly he was playing politics with this, but it wasn't made up. It was his use of a series of people who believed, in fact, that there was a missile gap. So it was, borderline, I would say, but not a lie.
It was a challenge. I would say it was a challenge throughout most of 1961 to figure out how to reveal that they knew that a missile gap was in their favor. McNamara had given what he thought was a background briefing in February of 1961, which he said not for attribution instead, thinking it was simply contextual information for journalists to feed on. And they printed in the papers that there was essentially no missile gap in the United States, well, certainly not in the favor of the Soviet Union, and the United States had held the lead. And Kennedy had to backtrack from that. And then throughout the course of '61, they're figuring out what do we do about this? How do we tell the country that things are actually better than they really are? And they finally, and Kennedy put himself in a tough position there too, because at Vienna, one of the first things that Kennedy says to Khrushchev as almost an icebreaker is, look, we're equal in the amount of forces that we have that can be thrown against each other. And Khrushchev said, that's great, glad to hear it. But then publicly later on, he would say, Mr. Kennedy says that we're equal, but in reality that means that we, the Soviets, are ahead. So that's one of the occasions, one of the precipitating factors that leads Kennedy to say, wait a second, we really do have to set the record straight now.
I'm tempted to ask whether you think in the current White House they're sitting around trying to figure out how to tell the country that things are better than we think they are, but I'm going to defer to our audience. Mel Leffler, you're next.
I very much enjoyed the talk. Allan, I'd like to pick up on...
Who are you, Mel Leffler?
I'm Mel Leffler.
And what's your association?
I'm a Miller Center faculty associate and a member of the history department. Allan, I'd like to pick up on a question that Mark was asking you succinctly. What did Kennedy learn? I'd like to ask that in the context of Kennedy's famous speech at American University, which I think almost everybody agrees is one of the most eloquent speeches of his presidency, in which he says, we need to rethink our entire relationship to the Soviet Union. In your view, what have you learned about the motivations for that speech, and how much importance do you attribute to that speech?
Well, I think that speech, the speech in 1963 at the American University, was a kind of introduction of a different way of thinking about the Cold War in Kennedy's mind. But I think to understand it, you have to think back to the two things that seemed to drive Kennedy from the very beginning of his presidency. One was his really very strong fear of nuclear war, much more than Eisenhower and Dulles did. I mean, they may have been fearful of it too, but it didn't stop them from taking big risks. And Kennedy came into office wanting to get away from brinkmanship. It was almost a visceral feeling that he had about nuclear weapons. And I think the great change in his view, although there were changes all along the way, I think what he learned most was from the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he was being pressured by everyone around him to attack the missiles in Cuba, the Soviet missiles in Cuba, which could very easily have created a nuclear war. And although he vacillated through the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was the one, he and his brother, were the ones who really decided that they were not going to attack the missiles, that they were going to create what they called a quarantine, which was really a blockade, which was really a violation of international law, but he did it anyway. And of course, the missiles were removed and the crisis ended. And I think that was a turning point in his presidency and in his life and in his view of the world. And it was only a few months later that you hear the American University speech. And you could feel, I think, in early, mid-1963, a change in the character of the Cold War. It didn't end the Cold War by any means, but it was a change in the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev and between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now you have to include there, I think, which was the building of the Berlin Wall, which at the time was seen by many Americans to be a crisis, But in fact, the Berlin Wall was the end of a crisis, about Berlin at least. And as Mark said, there was lots of anger among some Americans and many Europeans about the wall and about the absence of any effort by the United States to stop it. But in fact, the most dangerous, even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the Berlin Crisis in 1961. He was determined not to go to war in Berlin, and the wall saved him. It made a lot of people mad, but it was the end of the Berlin crisis. I think that helped him think through the missile crisis as well. So it was I think there was an evolution in his view. He was always a cold warrior. He was still sometimes reckless, but mostly he was becoming a person who felt that there was a road to peace without going to war. And I think that was the great lesson that he learned.
Okay, John Zimmerman. Thanks. And tell us who you are and why you're here, John.
I'm John Zimmerman. I teach at NYU, and I come here every year to work with the fellows on converting their academic work into op-ed pieces, because I'm also a journalist. Allan, I wanted to pick up on something you said in response to Emily's question about the deference of the press, and you referred to Kennedy's philandering. And I just wanted to know, as a historian, how that's entered into the way you've taken a measure of the man and his presidency. Obviously, we live in a very different time when the intimate lives of our public figures are exposed to all kinds of scrutiny. And I think it's fair to say that we impute all kinds of meanings to those intimate lives as well. And I was wondering, now that you spent a few years thinking about Kennedy, if it's in any way relevant. Is this just simply a prurient interest in a post hoc way? Or is it really of historical interest, and does it alter the way that you think about him and his presidency?
Well, I guess I'd answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, this is a history of the Kennedy years, but it's also a biography. And I don't think you can understand John Kennedy without the womanizing, which was extraordinary. But I don't think it has an enormous amount of impact on the way we understand his presidency, although not entirely. For example, he had a relationship with a woman who had a relationship with mafia people. And there were very dangerous relationships that he had that could have destroyed his presidency. And partly because of the deference of the press, he was able to get around it. So I don't think it's irrelevant, but neither do I think it's a central issue of his life. His health, I think, is actually a more difficult issue because it did affect the way he worked while he was president, and he couldn't walk for very long. He had to sleep several times during the day. He had to take hot baths during the day. He had a reduced work time because of his health problems, and they were very serious health problems. And it's not clear that he would necessarily even have lived through a second term. So these are things that never got really, I mean, certainly by now most people know of these things, but during his lifetime and even into the 70s, very few people knew about it. But I don't think they're irrelevant.
Great. Sir, and you, yes, red shirt, jacket.
I'm Morgan Burndyke, and I'm a fourth-year undergrad here, and I just show up in the Miller Center because I love these events. My question is, it seems to me as students, whenever we study Kennedy's foreign policy after the Bay of Pigs, one of the essential books that we read is Essence of Decision by Graham Allison and now Philip Zelikow, which of course offers alternatives to, as a political scientist, of course offers alternatives to thinking about things in terms of realism, and offers bureaucratic politics model and organizational structure model and things like that. What I saw as one of the interesting things when looking over transcripts and reading about the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular was the structure of the ExComm and how the lack of hierarchy there really seemed to contribute to Kennedy's decision-making. And I was wondering if you could comment on, A, what you think the relevance of these ideas is to Kennedy's presidency, and also, in answering that, how much of the foreign policy that came out of this presidency was Kennedy, and how much was the group of elder statesmen that he surrounded himself with?
Thank you.
Well, The Essence of Decision was the first book that I was assigned in my first class in my first year of graduate school. And of course, Graham Allison was at Harvard and was in the room when we had this discussion. And so I have a very strong memory of that, which was, first of all, a lot of tension, but also learning a lot about the missile crisis and about the way in which Allison worked on and so, yes, this book is about the process of the missile crisis. Everybody knew what happened by then, but this was a very smart and interesting book about how people make decisions. It's been a long time since I've read the book, but what I remember of it is that the openness of the missile crisis group, ExComm, really was an unusual way of, at least at the time, this unhierarchical discussion of what could be done and what should be done. Allison, I think it was Allison who first used the phrase where you sit is where you think, where you stand, excuse me. And in a world in which everybody has a strong view, if you have a hierarchical decision-making place, there are only a few people who are going to have an impact on the person who makes the decisions. And the ExComm, the Cuban Missile ExComm, which Allison really admired, allowed Kennedy to get an enormous range of opinions and allowed him to make a decision that he might not have been able to make if he had been moving up a hierarchical ladder of, as different ideas would have been pushed away before they came to the president. And I think that's had a big impact on the way policymakers have tried, not always successfully, have tried to make decisions more openly than they used to.
Could I just say that I think that the structure seemed to have played a pretty significant role in fashioning the more public dimensions of the crisis. The decision to move ahead with the quarantine rather than to move ahead with some other options. But perhaps the steps that were taken to actually resolve the crisis did not involve the full ExComm so much as it involved rump elements of the ExComm. And then even rump elements of ExComm going further if the deal that they had kind of struck through the back channel between Bobby and Dobrynin hadn't worked out, there was a way that they were going to move through the United Nations to have Utand actually make an offer that the Kennedy administration was going to be making. So behind the scenes, with smaller groups of people, those seem to be the moves that actually turned the tide. But I would absolutely agree that the more public dimension of the crisis, and maybe the more significant dimension, whether to go to war or not, invasion or not, air assaults or not, yeah, the flatter structures seem to help there. I'm not sure it's helped so much in Vietnam, but
one of the things that I found interesting about this was the taping of the Cuban Missile Crisis debates. And it's the only part of the Kennedy administration that has such a important and long taping. There are other tapes, other Kennedy tapes, but they not like Kennedy, not like Nixon, for example. And he was the only person who knew that it was being taped, and he was the only person who turned it on and off. Whether he did this on purpose or not, I don't know, but he left the tapes running when he left the room. And there were different groups that were in the room at various times, and one of the groups was the chiefs of the military, the chiefs of staff. And they were furious that Kennedy was thinking of anything other than an assault, bombing the missiles, and they were just they were just furious and contemptuous of Kennedy for what they saw his weakness. Had Kennedy listened to those tapes, and maybe he did, but I doubt it. He probably would have gone bananas, but it gives you a sense, I think, of how little cohorts can, sort of get together and make a kind of position that they can't get out of. And I think Kennedy, you have to give him credit for, there was so much pressure on him to bomb. And he just, in the end, realized that it was just too dangerous. When I said at the beginning, or I guess, Mark, you said that I said in the beginning, that he was both cautious and reckless. And in the missile crisis, he was cautious. And we're all lucky that he was.
Yes, David.
Thanks. David Greenberg, Rutgers University, and a one-time student of Allan's at Columbia. When I was in graduate school and through my whole professional career, I've learned about Kennedy, a revisionist view, you might say, as certainly the words Cold Warrior are used, hawkish, that he ran to the right of Nixon on national security, that his inaugural speech, far from being the idealistic message we remembered it, or that popular memory has, is really a sort of tough speech. And then several years ago, I was sort of surprised to see the front page of, it was either the Washington Post or New York Times, with the headline, Kennedy's Quest for Peace. And and I haven't studied it as you have, or Mark, or Mel, but in my own readings of Kennedy over the years, I wonder if we've gone too far with this portrait of him as this kind of long twilight struggle, Cold Warrior in the uber sense, and whether these elements that led to the peace speech in June of '63 weren't more developed earlier in his presidency, earlier in his career too. I haven't yet had a chance to read the book. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm wondering to what degree, Allan, in the book you kind of are trying to reposition, as Mark said with the series, for scholars as well as for the general public, Kennedy and his place kind of in the Cold War spectrum.
Well, I think Kennedy's rhetoric certainly would be consistent with your view, or with the view that you used to have anyway, about the Cold War. Although even the inaugural address, which sounds like a pure Cold War speech, it's more than that. It's it's an invitation to Americans to do more, do more for your country. Lots of Cold War in that speech too, but I think that was always a part of what he was trying to present. I think you also have to understand the intensity of the Cold War before he became president, and he inherited a very tense period in the Cold War. And he really had no choice, I think, but to confront the Cold War in some way. And he did it at some points in a belligerent way that probably didn't do him any good. But mostly, and this is what I was most surprised by when I was working on this, because I really didn't know much about what had happened in the Berlin summit, and it turned out that in the digital archive in the Kennedy Library, there's a complete transcript of the summit. And Kennedy was really trying to tamp down the Cold War and tamp down the rivalry, especially the atomic rivalry. And Kennedy left feeling that he'd been mauled by Khrushchev. But in fact, Khrushchev said some very important things in the summit, including saying, although he didn't stick to this, he said, that we wouldn't test any new weapons if you don't test any new weapons. And there were pieces of the summit in which Khrushchev was very conciliatory. Didn't feel that way to Kennedy, but there are parts of the summit that give you a sense of the much better relationship that began to grow in the aftermath, especially after the missile crisis.
Yes, Andrew?
Thank you. Andrew Mead McGee, graduate student without portfolio in the history department. And I very much enjoyed looking over the chapter that you sent out, Professor Brinkley, and hearing your comments and the excellent questions today. I have a more general question about the degree to which Kennedy's foreign policy decision-making in the early years of his presidency, roughly the time period you're writing about in this chapter and shortly thereafter, are distanced or not from his domestic policy concerns and the electoral considerations that accompany those. When we think about some of Kennedy's later foreign policy situation, you have civil rights issues in the South affecting America's perspective abroad in relation to communism. When you think about the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, you have his growing disenchantment with the military establishment and certain expert opinions. But I'm wondering, in this early period, how much of what's going on politically, domestically, with an eye towards the '62 midterm elections and just general pushing through of his economic and other domestic policy agendas are affecting how he's thinking about the foreign policy calculus?
Well, of course, foreign policy was by far his preference. There's this, well, it's not a story, it's true, but it is a story. He had a meeting with Nixon while Kennedy was president. It was the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, and he went to talk to Nixon. And Nixon said, you've got to send the troops in now. The Americans have made an incursion into Cuba, and you can't stop now, and you have to keep going. And then he talked to Fulbright, who told him he was crazy to have gone in, and it was absolutely the right thing to get out. And what this really suggests to me is that he didn't have a good process in his first months as president for making decisions. He'd pull everybody into the room, and it was chaos, and nobody knew who thought what, and eventually people just began to agree with what they thought Kennedy wanted. I think, you know, if that had been the case in the Cuban Missile Crisis, things would have been much worse. So I think he was a inexperienced person. I mean, he'd been in Congress for a long time, but he hadn't taken it very seriously. Mostly what he was being seriously about was going up the ladder. It just felt to me that he just didn't know how to take advice. He learned to, but he didn't at the beginning. And this is what quite a few people came to him after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And you can't understate the traumatic feeling of the Bay of Pigs that Kennedy understood. He wept. He left the room after a part of an aftermath meeting, and walked up and down the White House lawn through almost the entire night because he was so devastated. And he came into the room the next morning, and he was still just crushed. And people were coming in to talk to him and telling him what he did wrong, and it was just he felt it was the end, really. Yeah, and the cabinet, he left the cabinet because he was so overwhelmed by his failure. And the cabinet sat there talking about, how do we save the president? How do we save this man? So he had a lot to learn. I mean, this is like Mel's question. What did he learn? He learned how to take advice, and he turned to how to take advice in a way in which people were willing to give it to him, which was not the case in the beginning.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Carol Hill. I've been a resident of Albemarle County since 1970. And last night on the McClare Hour, they had a review for about 15 minutes of the new book about Jacqueline from the tapes of Schlesinger. And maybe it was because I was in Buffalo with 3 brand new babies, but I did not understand at the time that there was such a crisis in the White House, because on these tapes she's saying, please don't send me away from the White House. Please let me stay in the bunker. Let the children stay in the bunker. I want to walk the lawn with you to support you. And she just pleaded. And I didn't realize there was such a crisis of personal danger in the White House at that time. The press didn't show that, or you didn't hear it.
Well, this would be the missile crisis.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there was a debate over whether Jacqueline and the children should go out of the city or whether they should stay in the White House to make it seem as though things were okay, and she did stay. That doesn't mean, well, let me go back to the beginning of your question, which was the book that came out on Tuesday, of which I've read a small amount. But from what I've read and from what I've heard of others, I wouldn't take this too seriously. Many of you might remember who's old enough or who knows enough about the Kennedy world, the Life magazine, in which just a couple of days after the assassination, Teddy White did a Life piece in which he talked about their presidency as being Camelot, and that that's the image that has been, has survived ever since. And that's what these interviews were. This is more Camelot. And everything about Jack Kennedy, whose marriage was not really a great marriage. You would never know that from these interviews. Everything that she says about Kennedy is reverential. Almost everybody else is criticized, and so it's interesting about her. It's not particularly interesting about him. I don't think. But I haven't read it all. So
we need to excuse me. We need to move on. Brent.
Brent Siebel, I'm a graduate student here in the history department. This kind of builds off Professor Greenberg's question a little bit, but over the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about the tensions between the Obama administration and his military leadership. And that seems as though that's an important theme for the Kennedy administration as well, and it sort of frames this idea of him as a rhetorical Cold Warrior who's having big trouble with his own military. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And if it does, in how you talk about it, how that intersects with partisanship and the military, if you see that there's a connection there.
Well, he did have some problems with the military, especially with the high-ranking military. And that's why he was so dependent on Maxwell Taylor, who was, of course, a very important figure in the military, but by the time Kennedy was president, he was no longer a major figure in the military and wasn't really very respected by the leaders of the military. And he relied on Kennedy relied on Maxwell Taylor more than he relied on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that's one of the ways I think, and Maxwell Taylor, he wasn't a dove by any means, but Taylor warned him about the way in which the Joint Chiefs of Staff works and how they're more likely to come out with a belligerent result than a conciliatory result. And so I think that's one of the ways that he managed his relationship with the military. He took advice from Taylor and had a bit of skepticism about what the Joint Chiefs were telling him.
I saw two more hands. You, sir, back there, and then the final question from Sid. Did you go first? Yes, sir. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Like many, I remember clearly the very day of the assassination. And I accepted, after some months of doubt, the later conclusions of the Warren Commission. But in the last year or so, my reluctance to doubt the Warren Commission's report, that there was no conspiracy, have changed. And a number of books came out starting in the early 90s. There's a book that came out again in a new edition by L. Fletcher Prouty called The Secret Team. Prouty, fairly high in the ranks of the military and intelligence, had come out with an earlier book on the assassination of JFK. My point, to get to the root of it, is that through his carrying on of the Cuban Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis, and through his obvious, increasingly clear doubts as to the feasibility of bumping up Vietnam military activity, that he was on the point of saying, okay, let me get through the '64 election and I'll take care of that. he created a lot of antagonism in high places, in the intelligence community, in the military community, and in the State Department. That's my conclusion after reading a number of books in the last several years. I just like your reaction. What I'm suggesting, of course, is that the assassination narrative that we've all become accustomed to is in serious doubt, in my view.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I don't rule out conspiracies, but neither do I embrace them. I don't believe that Kennedy's, first of all, I don't believe that Kennedy would have or could have ended the Vietnam War in 1964 and 1965. But even if that were true, that doesn't mean that that had anything to do with the assassination. So I don't really have an answer to your question, except that I know that many, many people have many, many views about why the assassination, how the assassination occurred. And some of them are very plausible, some of them are completely implausible. But I have no way of answering these questions. But thank you for your thoughts about it.
And the last question from Sid Milkus. And while Professor Milkus waits for the microphone, I want to thank him and Professor Veshla Weaver, both faculty associates here at the Miller Center. I want to thank them both for organizing this colloquial series.
So I'm Sid Milkus, as you've just said. I'm at the Miller Center and also the Department of Politics. And I was curious about Vietnam, too, because you know, when I think of Kennedy, because he was cut off at the promise, he lends himself so much to counterfactuals. What you say about his health is very sobering, but I would like to hear a little bit more about what you think would have happened in Vietnam had he not been assassinated. But I want to connect that to Lyndon Johnson, because I always think of them as a tandem of sorts, and what you think of Lyndon Johnson as a successor to Kennedy. Was he worthy heir apparent? He brought into fruition many of the promises, particularly in domestic policy, you mentioned. Or was he the Mordred who destroyed Kennedy's Camelot and really did great damage to the idea of a new frontier?
Well, I do think that Lyndon Johnson was just older enough than Kennedy to have a much more sort of Cold War vision. He thought back to the fall of China, for example, and the damage that it did to the Democratic Party. And so it isn't implausible to think that Johnson would have been a much more belligerent figure in the Vietnam War than Kennedy would have been. Kennedy didn't like the Vietnam War, and yet he pursued it. And he pursued it not only by sending in 8,000 troops, but he pursued it by encouraging a coup to kill the president, well, not to kill, but to remove the president of Vietnam, although it ended up that he was killed. And so he had a big stake in this war by the time he died. Now, nobody knows what he would have done after that. And he would say during his lifetime that he would start pulling the troops out in 1964 and he would be out of the war by 1965. But he never said that he would do that if it meant the fall of South Vietnam. He thought that by 1964 and 1965, they could have stabilized South Vietnam. Turned out not to be true. You also have to remember that Kennedy's a politician, and what would it have been like in a Cold War era if a president decided, we're just not going to fight this war anymore. We'll let South Vietnam go, even though, 30,000, 50,000, however many might have died by then. So I'm skeptical of the idea that Kennedy would have gotten out of Vietnam more easily. It's possible. And maybe after he had been reelected, he might have been willing to do it. But I'm skeptical of the idea that he would have made a huge difference. So I think one other thing, you have to remember that even through 1967, there was enormous support for the war. And it wasn't until '68 that it began to deteriorate. And by then he would have been very near the end of his presidency.
Well, I want to thank Professors Brinkley and Silverstone for a terrific discussion of the entire Kennedy administration and more. And thank you all very much for your good questions and your participation.